Hey there, and welcome to our first lecture on identity. There are going to be 2 lectures in this series, and they are going to deal with issues of ethnicity, gender, etc. This is Ms. Grandquist again. Hope that you are getting something out. So let's start with, what jobs do you think these people would do? So just take a moment or so and look at this and say, okay, which one of these people does which one of these things? All right, so you can check the notes to see whether you were correct on the particular jobs. The basic thing here is you were probably basing your decisions on some sort of stereotype. All right, whether it was a gender stereotype, an ethnic stereotype, or whatever. So if we look at this, do we really think men are going to be the childminders? Do we really think women are going to be the truck drivers? And that kind of thing. And it's one of those things that we have to understand about ourselves. What are our own biases and our own ways? Okay, so we're going to start today by talking about gender. So the first thing we need to understand is how gender differs from biological sex. So your biological sex refers to the reproductive organs with which you were born, whether you have male organs or female organs. Gender takes that biology and says, okay, what does culture say about it? What attributes are associated with having that biology? And we are looking at expected behavior, cultural expectations, etc. And so here we're going to talk not male and female, but masculine and feminine. If you look on the side here, we have a picture of a purse, and we tend to say that carrying a purse is a feminine attribute. Well, why? I mean, that seems a kind of arbitrary thing for our society to have decided that carrying things in a particular bag is a feminine attribute because guys never have to carry stuff. That doesn't make any sense. And it is okay for guys to carry their stuff in a backpack or a messenger bag. It's just not okay for guys to carry stuff in a purse. That's a pretty arbitrary line for a society to draw in terms of a gender expectation. On the other hand, we also have the skateboarding at the bottom, and skateboarding is often associated with masculine and being, with masculinity and being a male-dominated sport. Again, there's really kind of no biological reason that this has been done. It is a fairly arbitrary line that has been drawn by our society. The next thing that we get into is how many genders. So the U.S. recognizes 2 genders. We recognize a masculine gender and a feminine gender to go along with the male sex and the female sex. This is not necessarily globally true. There are some societies in the world that recognize a 3rd gender that blends some attributes that we would associate with either masculine or feminine. And there are some societies, like Indonesia, for example, that actually recognizes 5 different genders. And so the way that we look at things around the world is very, very different from society to society. This gets us then into gender roles, where society says, okay, we have certain activities and occupations which we are going to say are masculine or feminine and are therefore associated with a particular gender. For example, in our society, we tend to say that child care is a feminine occupation, and we tend to think of it that way. And if you look at the number of people involved in child minding and child care across the country, I think that the dominant number by a significant margin is going to be female, in large part because of these gender roles. And we do this because we say, oh, well, nurturing and taking care of people and cleaning up after them, well, those must be feminine attributes, therefore females should do this job. Similarly, we look at soldiers and we tend to say that being a soldier is a masculine occupation because protecting and fighting is seen to be masculine attributes. And so we've done the same kind of thing with these roles, where we have taken particular parts of the jobs and associated those as attributes with one gender or another. We also tend to ascribe different values to gendered occupations, and you can see that by looking at the amount of money that we are willing to pay people doing those things. We go back to our child minding activity, and even though everyone says children are the most important thing and taking care of children is the most important thing, we don't actually pay our child minders a great deal. And there's been some studies done looking at that where they say, well, if this was a more male-dominated industry, the likelihood is the wages would be higher. And so that's kind of an interesting point to look at. You also look at something, we're going to bring this up in a few more places in this particular lecture, is when we look at jobs that women do in the home. So when you look at a job like cooking that women do in the home, or not just women, but mostly women are going to be the primary cooks of their family, we tend to not value that greatly. We tend to look upon that as being just part of their duty, getting dinner ready and things like that. And it has no economic value associated with it. However, when we do that in a restaurant, it's mostly done by men, and we give that particular job a great deal more value then. We also create gender hierarchies where one gender is seen as more valuable than another, and usually it has been men over women and males over females, and therefore we have an unequal distribution of cultural and societal resources like education, healthcare. So the gender gap can refer to a number of different things. It can refer to differences in the way that societies treat people of particular genders. It can be a difference in the number of people expected to be present of a particular sex and a number that is actually there. We have talked a number of times about the quote-unquote missing girls of Asia, where we expect that there would be a lot more girls there, but due to a number of practices, there are not. And we can also look at the longevity gap, where women generally live longer than men. This particular map that you are looking at is detailing the average earning of women versus the average earning of men, and how much lower it is for women. So when we look at all women working versus all men working, women are tending to make about 30%, 15 to 30% less than men do. And overall. And this can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It is getting better in some places. In others it is not. We've seen this trend of staying between 15 and 30% for more than a decade now. And the question is kind of why. So we could look at a number of things here, like the glass ceiling, this idea that not just women, but women and other minorities are prevented from rising to the tops of their fields by some sort of glass ceiling, that there's only a certain level to which they can rise, and then after that they are going to be prevented from being promoted anymore. They're not going to be able to get to that top level. Another thing is looking at how much of women's work is actually being recognized. So if we look at rural areas, for example, on a family farm, is everybody listed as an employee? Are we actually listing women as employees and paying them for their labor, or just expecting them to do the labor? It is fairly common globally for women's work being done in the home to not be assigned any sort of economic value, even though if you had to hire people to do those things, it would cost quite a bit of money, but we still don't assign any economic value to that work done in the home by women. Even when we get to comparing the exact same job, however, with the same education levels, the same experience, etc., there is still usually a gap in pay between men and women, and this ranges anywhere from between 7 to 10% for the exact same job at the exact same level. And so that kind of goes to show us that even though we are getting closer, there is still a significant difference in earnings. Okay, gender and geography. Historically, we did not really look at gender in terms of geography. The view of the adult male was considered to be the view of everybody. This is pretty common in a patriarchal society, so it's pretty new that we're really looking at gender issues within geography in terms of space. Our first thing to talk about here is public space versus private space. So public space was basically that space which was technically available to everybody. In reality, however, it was historically dominated by males. Private space, and this is where geographers have really not done a great deal of study, private space is that area which is only accessible to certain people, usually only accessible to a family or a very small group. That's what we consider a private space. And this is often the home. And there's been very, very little geographic research done on the idea of the home and the geography of the home. And this was the area where women were supposed to be dominant historically. So you had this public space versus private space. Over time, however, what we've seen is that economic, political power, etc., is going to be held in the public space. So women have begun to enter that public space in order to get their share of that political and economic power. And this has caused some changes and in some places, some problems in terms of the now sharing of that space between different genders. Gendered space then is going to be an area that is predominantly used by one gender over another. So you can think about this in terms of, say, a woman's shoe store, for example. They just sell women's shoes. Can men go in there? Sure. Do men go in there often? Not really. And this is going to be, therefore, a place that is kind of a gendered space and is going to be mainly dominated by females. You can see on here a little bathroom sign that, of course, is our, probably best known gendered space. One gender goes into one bathroom, the other gender goes into the other bathroom. All right. If you are not sure which gender you belong to because you are transsexual, or perhaps you come from a place where they recognize more genders, well, at least in the U.S., we don't really give you much options beyond the two genders that we recognize. The little boys clubhouse sign, this is a pretty common thing, from childhood, trying to create a gendered space, no girls allowed, etc. Only boys can come in here. But we can see that in terms of a number of places around big businesses and things like that, where, the boardroom, for example, is really kind of a male space. Locker rooms, for example, are gendered spaces. And you can think about those of you who spend much time in locker rooms, are there behaviors that take place in that locker room that would not take place in that non-gendered space? The map at the bottom is kind of an interesting one because it's looking at harassment of women in public spaces. And so in large part, this is a reaction against women coming into the public space and an attempt to try to prevent them from doing so. So that instead, women are being forced out of the public space due to harassment, whether it's catcalls or stalking or whatever. If you want to look at the slide in the notes view, you can see all the different types of harassment that are going on. And it's a way that we do see in some places a trying to prevent women from feeling comfortable in that public space and therefore prevent them from gaining Okay, where you live matters. It matters in terms of the lifestyle that you are going to lead. And we know this, but it also matters in terms of gender. So our women living in the developing world versus women living in the developed world are going to have very, very different lives and very different expectations placed on them. This is also going to be true urban versus rural. So the lifestyles, especially of wealthy women in an urban area, are going to look more like the developed world than they would in the, and this is talking about a developing country, but so those wealthy urban women, their lifestyles are going to look a lot more like women in the developed world than they will like than the ones in rural areas of that same country do. So there's significant gender differences. We can look at access to education. One of the things you can do is go and look at your textbook and look at literacy rates and the differences in literacy rates between men and women around the world. And a lot of this has to do with access to education. And so we often see in developing countries that women have a lot less access to education. They're either pulled out of school earlier or they're prevented from going to school at all, whether it's because they are child brides and being married off very young, or because the family can only afford to send one child to school and they choose to send the son. It kind of depends on the particular situation. Franchise and political power, we're going to see that around the world, especially in developing countries, but even in developed countries, male dominance of the top positions in the country economically and politically is still basically the rule. There are some places where women are making political inroads and economic inroads into those top positions, but globally they still haven't gotten very far. And when we look at developing countries, it's not just those top positions, but pretty much any position of authority throughout the country is going to be dominated by men. We do see in the developed world that there has been a reduction in inequality, especially over the last 100 years. But it's still, it's only fairly recent that women have received the right to vote in most countries, and they do not yet have the same level of political power that men do. Mobility in developing countries, women are going to have a lot less mobility than women in developed countries do. A lot of this has to do with the high birth rates and the number of children that they are caring for. But even in the developed countries, we tend to see, and we looked at this back in population when we were looking at activity spaces, their activity space tends to be much shorter and much more concentrated around the home, whereas men's activity space tends to go much farther from the home. Health. This is where we're going to see our big discrepancies, health and economics. So we have the longevity gap, where we know that globally most women live longer than most men, although this is much less in developing countries than in developed countries. The big issue health-wise for women in developing countries is access to health care and access to nutrition, and both of those are lower than their male counterparts. And we are seeing, therefore, that this is going to lead to much greater risks in terms of pregnancies, that there's going to be between 80 and 600 times the risk in a pregnancy than there is in the developed world, therefore much higher maternal mortality rates. We are going to see that female children have the least access to health care and the least access to nutrition. Female infanticide is going to play a part in creating imbalanced populations. We are going to see that domestic violence is going to, in a number of places, not be seen as a crime at all. Family structure is seen as of the greatest importance, so a woman fleeing, even taking her children with her and fleeing an abusive situation, will often be counseled to return to the home, as protecting the family as a whole and that unit as a whole is seen as more important than protecting her well-being. Oftentimes in courts, the judges are going to be older and male, and while this may not mean that they intend to be prejudiced, it does mean that they are not necessarily victims of the same issues that they are deciding on. Economic power. One of the things with women in the developing world is most of their labor is unpaid. So even though women produce more than 50% of the food in the world, very few of them are getting paid money to do so. In some areas, like in Africa, for example, women produce 70% of the food, and still most of their labor is going to be unpaid. They're also building homes, digging wells, making clothes, planting and harvesting crops, but because they're doing a lot of these things for their own families, that labor is not recognized economically. It doesn't become part of the country's GDP and all of those things, and therefore it's really unrecognized labor. And the big thing to look at in this is who owns the land. Government and NGO development projects have actually increased that inequality in a number of places because they focus on the male space, and because males own the land, most of their projects have increased the money that men get while not giving any money to the female workers on those same areas. In the developed world, women are on average between 35 and 39% of the labor force, but receive much less than that in terms of the money that they take home. Okay, so that's going to end our look into gender in terms of identity and the effects that that's going to have geographically. If you have any questions, see your teachers in class. Don't forget to do your reading of Chapter 5, and our next lecture in